guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. Today we're going to be talking about the very strange death of Jonathan Luna. As far as I can tell, this is a very popular case within the true crime community, but I'd personally never heard of it until I started researching this last week. So I don't really know if it was just more of a popular case maybe in the US where it happened, or I don't know, maybe it's just popular within true crime because it's a very interesting case. But yes, let's talk about it. So Jonathan Luna was a 38-year-old assistant United States attorney. He lived and worked in Maryland. He worked in Baltimore but lived in Elkridge with his wife and 2 children. He'd grown up in the Bronx in New York, and he was sort of surrounded by sort of drugs and crime where he grew up, but he was always a very, very determined young man. He wanted to be educated and he wanted to learn things and he wanted to be successful. And he grew up to be very successful. He was a very well respected attorney. Throughout his years as an attorney, Jonathan worked on all sorts of cases, but he did a lot of very hard crime. He did a lot of drug rings, drug dealing, he did paedophilia, sexual abuse, murder. He did the hard stuff. And I always like to give you an idea of the sort of character of these people when I'm talking about it, just to sort of humanise them a little bit more. And this is a direct quote from one of Jonathan's friends. His friend said he was one of those guys who had charisma. There was always a smile on his face. Prosecutors tend to be fairly hard-nosed and crabby guys, but John was not that. He was cultured and gentlemanly. So I think he was pretty well respected and very well loved within his profession and also in his personal life. Which is why it was a very big shock when on the morning of the 4th of December 2003, Jonathan's body was found under very, very weird circumstances. So to get a little bit of context on this case, we need to talk about Jonathan's job. Like I've mentioned, he was an attorney, he dealt with a lot of criminals, and obviously he would have had a lot of enemies. Now around the time of his death, Jonathan was working on a very difficult case. There was a drug ring involved and also a drug-related murder. And the FBI had got involved. The FBI were probably trying to cover some things up. The FBI had taken one of the guys who was on trial and used him as a spy. The guy, whilst he was in a halfway house being used as a spy, was still shooting people. He was still on drugs. He was violating the terms of his sort of probation. It wasn't even on probation. Violating the terms of him being in a halfway house, I suppose, on a daily basis. And the FBI were turning a blind eye to this every single time because he was a very important informant. So that is the sort of case that Jonathan was currently involved in. A lot of stuff was going wrong, there were a lot of mess ups, the evidence was going wrong. Jonathan was sort of bumbling through, and it was very unlike him because Jonathan was a very, very good attorney. He was always very switched on in the courtroom, he always knew exactly what he was doing, he was a very smart and sly guy. So the fact that he was just bumbling through this case and it seemed like he had no idea what he was doing was in itself very weird. And that is pretty much all I'm going to give you about the court case that Jonathan was currently involved in. I did do a lot of research on it, but to be honest, a lot of it just went straight over my head. I don't really know much about court and law and things like that. But if you want to find out more about the court case, I would definitely recommend listening to Case Files podcast on the Jonathan Luna case. That will sort of give you a much deeper insight into the court case, but I think I've covered the important bits here. So Jonathan was working on a plea deal for this case, and he'd been working on it for a long time. There was a lot of logistics involved. He couldn't offer a plea deal because it was drug-related murder, and I don't think legally he could. So he spent all day in the office trying to figure this out, and he just couldn't. Shortly after 9 PM on the 3rd of December 2003, Jonathan called a defence lawyer called Arcangelo Tuinelli and left a voicemail for him, and the voicemail basically said, "I've been working this plea deal all day, I'm going to go home now and work on it more from home." That was shortly after 9 PM. And then a bit of time after that, Jonathan gets up from his desk and just leaves without saying a word. Now obviously it was late at night and it's not out of the ordinary that he was going home. He left his glasses and his mobile phone sitting on his desk. His car was clocked leaving the car park for the building at 11:38 PM. Now although this was a federal building, the security was shockingly bad. There was no cameras within the office, there were no cameras really outside. The only camera that sort of clocked Jonathan was the camera in the car park, and even that camera couldn't tell who was driving the car. They could just tell that his car had left the car park. And this is where Jonathan embarked on a very strange journey. So like I mentioned, Jonathan lived in Maryland, and his car journey took him over state lines into Delaware. His credit card records show him withdrawing about $200 from an ATM near Newark about 1 AM that night. However, of course, the camera security around the ATM happened to be broken on that particular night, so there's no video footage of Jonathan doing this. He travelled from Delaware into New Jersey and then crossed over into Pennsylvania. And of course he was crossing state lines, so on this journey Jonathan encountered a lot of tolls. Now the first few toll booths he used his Easy card or Easy Pass, which is basically just a electronic card that you could use at toll booths. But after he'd withdrawn this $200, he switched to using cash for these toll booths and his Easy Pass wasn't used again. Jonathan's last toll ticket from the Reading Lancaster interchange toll booth actually had a spot of blood on it, which suggests that by the time Jonathan had reached his toll booth, he was already injured. So at this Reading Lancaster interchange, he actually exited the road. He parked up behind a warehouse, and it was actually a warehouse for a drilling company called Sensenig and Weaver. Tyre tracks showed that his car was actually parked up for a little bit of time before it rolled into a creek. And this was predicted to be around 4 AM. Now the first employees arrived at Sensenig and Weaver about 5:30 AM. The employees arrived and saw a car with the engine still on, front end in a stream, and the lights were still turned on also. Blood was smeared all over the driver's side door as well as all over the front left of the car, and when authorities arrived they actually found a pool of blood in the footwell of the rear seats of the car. They also found Jonathan's body face down in the stream underneath the car engine, absolutely covered in stab wounds. He was still wearing his suit from the day as well as a black overcoat, and he had his court ID around his neck still. And the cash that he'd withdrawn at the ATM earlier was scattered around him. I've seen some conflicting reports as to how much cash was actually scattered around him. Some reports have said it was just $30 and some reports have said it was the full $200, so I'm not entirely sure on how much there was there. Jonathan had been stabbed 36 times. Most of the wounds were concentrated around his back, neck and chest. As well as this, his throat was cut, he had genital mutilation, his hands were absolutely slashed to pieces, and he had a head injury. However, despite all this, it was actually revealed that he didn't die from these injuries. Jonathan had died from drowning, from being face down in this stream. And although he was covered in stab wounds, a lot of these wounds were just sort of superficial, and they weren't like deep enough to cause any real damage. Of course there were some that were pretty serious, but a lot of them were just like very slight cuts, and they looked like they had been done with hesitation. Now I don't know about you, but when I first read this, my first thought was somebody was threatening him with a knife, maybe like slightly cutting him to make him do what they wanted him to do. The case obviously was ruled as a homicide, and it was ruled as a homicide by 3 different coroners. The first one who ruled it as a homicide actually moved on very shortly after, and then the FBI went to a second coroner and said to the coroner, "You need to rule this as a suicide," and the coroner refused, and it was actually backed up by a third coroner as well who said no, this is 100% a homicide. The FBI's reason behind saying this is a suicide is they've said that there's no evidence that Jonathan has anybody else with him on this journey, it was just him, so they say obviously nobody else did it, it was a suicide. Now of course it's not totally out of the realms of possibility that Jonathan did commit suicide here. I've already mentioned that he was really struggling in his job, and what I mentioned earlier isn't actually even half of it. Jonathan was involved in a case where he had brought in a lot of money as evidence into a courtroom. Like I said, it was a drug ring, drug dealing sort of case, and the person who he was prosecuting had actually been found to have a lot of cash in his house, which obviously was some pretty solid evidence against him. And Jonathan had this wheeled into the courtroom. He had it wheeled in 3 separate heat-sealed plastic boxes, and he was in charge of keeping it safe, so he sent it to the evidence room, or the evidence vault. And it was there for 10 days when somebody finally realised that one of the boxes was missing. Now it was reported in the media that this box that was missing had $36,000 in it, which is a hell of a lot of money, and Jonathan actually happened to be found dead with 36 stab wounds, and I'm not sure if that is linked in any way, but I thought that was very interesting. However, although this is what the local media reported, there was actually $38,100 in the box, so not $36,000 like they were saying. One of the only people who had had direct access to this money was Jonathan, so he was immediately thrust into the spotlight, and he was a person of suspicion in this. A lot of people said there is no way Jonathan could have done this at all. He was very upstanding guy, and he just wouldn't have done something like that. And there was never any evidence to suggest that he did take it. However, Jonathan was actually in significant amounts of credit card debt at the time. But the money was in a evidence vault, which loads and loads of people had access to in the 10 days the money was in there. So although it looked suspicious that Jonathan was in this credit card debt and suddenly all this money went missing, There's nothing really to say he took it. It could have been anybody, really. Anybody could have broken in this time as well. It was in there for a long time, and had criminals known that it was in there, it would have been pretty easy for them to figure out how to get it. Jonathan was also scheduled to do a polygraph test about this missing money, and it was scheduled for a little bit after his death, and obviously he never did it because he died. So as well as this awful case that he was bumbling through, this money had also gone missing, which obviously did not look good for him, and the media in the weeks after his death absolutely attacked him. It was a complete attack of character. They said that he was found on adult dating sites and trying to solicit sex, which of course he was married to someone. I'm not entirely sure if this was true, but the media took everything they could to try and absolutely destroy Jonathan's character in the aftermath of his death. Whereas in reality, he was an attorney, he was a good member of society, he helped people. So of course there are reasons here as to why Jonathan could have committed suicide in this case. But if he was to commit suicide, why would he do it in such a strange way? Why drive through 3 different state lines and commit suicide in such odd conditions so far away from home? That's what doesn't make sense to me. Now, I personally lean towards this being a murder because he was an attorney, he had so many enemies, there are so many people that could have wanted to harm him in some way, and maybe someone finally did. Now, from what I can gather, the police really, or the FBI, this is more of an FBI case than a police case, really didn't look into what happened to Jonathan. They could have found so many suspects, so many people that could have wanted to harm him. But as far as I can tell, it was pretty much just swept under the rug. It was ruled as a homicide, and that was pretty much where it ended. I'm sure they did look into people and they did do some work towards it, but I couldn't find anything that suggested this was the massive case that it should have been. It clearly wasn't a robbery or like money motivated, because Jonathan was found with cash laying around his body. So if somebody was just doing this just to rob him, they would have taken the money. And also if somebody was just trying to rob him, why would they have made him drive through all these states just to do so? The coroners were so convinced this was definitely a homicide. He had slashes all over his hands, it was very defensive, he had sort of marks under his fingernails which suggested he was trying to defend himself. He had mutilated genitals, which although he probably could have done that to himself, why would he? Why would he have done that? It just all suggested that somebody else was trying to harm him and make him suffer in the worst way possible. I personally think the most likely possibility here is Jonathan got to his car and somebody was waiting for him and forced him into the driver's seat and made him drive whilst holding a knife to him. Now, the knife that Jonathan was stabbed with was actually revealed to be a penknife, and it wasn't found for 6 weeks after his death. Now, this is very, very strange. Of course, when his body was found, it was a massive crime scene. It was searched so many times and no weapon was ever found. However, 6 weeks later, a penknife is found right next to where his body was. And this is either one of two things. This is either very, very shoddy police work in that they didn't find this penknife sooner, or it was planted there afterwards. Now, this is still an open case in Pennsylvania, and because it's an open case, the police or the FBI will not comment on it. And this also means that the autopsy files have never been released, and I would love to see the autopsy files on this case. There is currently a $100,000 reward on this case for any information that leads to the solving of this crime. And that is pretty much it. Although there is a lot of compelling evidence as to why Jonathan would have wanted to take his own life, his friends and family have said that there is no way he would have done that. And it was actually very interesting. One of his colleagues said that it was very unlike Jonathan to be bumbling through this case and to be making so many mistakes. And his colleague actually said that he wouldn't be surprised if Jonathan was messing up this case as much as possible just to bring light to the police corruption, the FBI corruption that was happening behind the scenes, which I like to think was true. But that is pretty much all I have on the case. If you have any more information that I haven't mentioned, make sure you comment it nicely down below. Any requests for cases that you want to see, again, make sure you comment it. Make sure you subscribe to my channel if you like this, and I will see you in my next video. Bye guys!